Hey everybody, welcome to the Brian and Pete podcast. Pete is out today being awesome somewhere in the world. I actually have no idea where he is, but I know that he's not here. And so we're just going to imagine and assume that Pete's out there being awesome. I get the joy of spending some time talking with James Fraser this morning and interviewing him about his work with the persecuted church. James is part of Release International, and we'll hear more about him in a moment here, but I want to say that when I came over here to Scotland and started Rehope Church in 2005, one of the first things that we decided to do is we wanted to give away 10% of our church's offerings to the wider church. And so we looked right away for an organization that would support the persecuted church, because I feel so blessed to be a part of God's work in this nation and in this country, and coming from the U.S. and just the joy of being a part of the Christian family in those environments. And yet for years, and then going through my training, alert and aware that our Christian family around the world is in very different situations. And so we searched right away in 2005 for an organization to support. And I remember this guy, Stephen Irwin, said, I found this one. This one looks good. Let's start giving to Release International. So since 2005, our church has been supporting them. And over the years, I've been able to get to know what's going on more and more. But today we get to spend some time talking with James. James, welcome to the Brian and Pete podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be with you. And let me say, first of all, we're so thankful and blessed by Rehope's support over all that period of time. So, we really love you guys for that, and you've been an important part of what we've been doing. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Hey, what is the thing that first captured your heart? What's first stirred your heart for the persecuted church?
Well, I think it's something I'd always heard about growing up in church. I had, the privilege of growing up in church, and it was always something that was maybe there in the background mentioned, so I was aware of it. And, hearing the stories and seeing the circumstances of those believers really makes you think how seriously you're taking your own faith. So I think that would have been part of my journey. And certainly my wife has always been incredibly passionate to love and serve persecuted Christians, so she was an influence on me in that way. But I think I would say one of the really important things that steered my heart in that direction was appreciating that the church is one global body. I had this great privilege to go on a short-term mission trip to Africa when I was a student, and that opened my eyes so much. I think up until that point I'd probably had quite a sheltered experience of Christian faith, and to see that the church operated and existed on that scale with people from every background, culture, tribe, nation, social background, economic background, political background, we're all part of this one body. I think that really impacted me. And then when you think about persecution in that context, that part of our body, our brothers and sisters, is suffering, that's really something that we should be concerned about. So all of that kind of led me in this direction.
So how did you end up getting connected to Release International specifically, and what is your role?
Yeah, so Release International is a Christian ministry called to love and serve persecuted Christians. We're working with partners on the ground, about 30 different countries across the world, bringing all sorts of prayerful, pastoral and practical support to them. And I first got involved 9 years ago. It was a job that was advertised, and I applied for it. It ticked a lot of the boxes of what I wanted to do. And I'm really involved in the UK facing side of our ministry. So that's an important part of what we want to do as well, because we're trying to raise the voice of persecuted Christians here in the UK. We're calling the church to stand in fellowship with them. And above and beyond that as well, we're wanting to learn lessons of discipleship with them. And I think in that sense, it's very much a two-way relationship. We're equal partners in this together. And my role really is to be involved in that in Scotland and into the north of England as well. And I lead a team of what we call regional engagement managers who do this all across the UK. So we're regularly speaking in churches, we're attending Christian events and conferences, we're organising our own events with our international partners to let Christians here get the first person voice of persecuted Christians. And then also I'm involved in travelling to some of the areas where we're working across the world. So, it's a full-on and diverse role, but it's so rewarding as well.
Interesting. What's something that you've learned through your work here that's changed your faith?
Oh, well, there's so much stuff. And, especially every time that you go to one of the countries and see people face to face, you just learn so much. You're so humbled by it. But I think probably to sum it up, I think the most profound thing is just to be reminded about what is really important in life. So, there's so many things that distract us and that are clamouring for our attention all the time in the West. Expectations that we have for life, so many things that we get stressed out about and anxious about that when you sit back and think about it, they don't actually really matter all that much.
Yeah.
And so when you come face to face with brothers and sisters who might have lost everything just for following Jesus, and yet you see that they can be so filled with gratitude and joy and hope and confidence in God, I think that just gets things into perspective and has a lasting impact.
Wow. Okay, can we jump into some stories? Can we talk about this? Do you have any recent stories of someone that you've met or heard about who's been suffering for their faith in Jesus?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll tell you about a story of a pastor that I met on a recent trip to Southeast Asia. I need to be a little bit vague on the details of this, but he was a relatively young guy, but he was a senior leader in the church movement he was part of, and he had devoted his life to reaching out to this minority people group where the church, the people didn't have much exposure to the gospel at all, so it was a very young church. But that whole vision and ministry of his had cost him so much. He was being hounded by the authorities. He'd been arrested several times. He'd had all sorts of allegations against him, even had a gun pointed at him. And he had good reason to believe from what had happened to other people. He knew that his life really could genuinely be at risk. And he had a wife, he had children. I think when family comes into it like that, it makes a big impact on you.
Yeah,
and,
wow.
And he sort of said to us, I wonder sometimes, should I stop this work? But then he thinks, well, who would do it if I wasn't here? Who would look after these people? Who would support this growing church? And so despite all of these risks, he told us, definitively, I'm committed to keeping this going. And then he said something really interesting to us. He said that he saw the persecution that he was suffering as a validation that he was on the right track in the work that he was doing. And so you hear things like this all the time, and they maybe turn your expectations on their head and force you to rethink the way that you've been thinking about things. So that's a very recent encounter that had an impact on me.
Wow. What was the most moving or challenging experience you've had working with persecuted believers?
I think the challenge comes from hearing daily about real ongoing violence and intense suffering that people experience. Especially in places like Nigeria, for example, but increasingly in other places in Africa and India too. But, in Nigeria, every week there's another story about a Christian village being attacked, 10, 20, 30 people killed, hundreds displaced, pastors kidnapped, young women kidnapped, churches burned to the ground. And all of that has been going on for 2 decades in Nigeria.
Wow.
Right? And the Nigerian government doesn't seem to be able to do anything to stop it. Some people have even accused the military in Nigeria of being complicit in it. The rest of the world doesn't really know about it and care about it. And so you're seeing thousands of Christians being killed every year, tens of thousands more being forced to flee. And I think it's hard and impacts you to hear that all the time. So, there's a guy called Luca whose story we cover in our current magazine. My colleague met him last year when he was in Nigeria. And in February 2022, his village was raided by this militant group. His wife, his parents, 2 of his children were killed.
Wow.
The militants then destroyed his farm and his business, and they left his one remaining child with life-changing injuries. And so he's got all this trauma to deal with, and he's just representative of hundreds and thousands of others. So hearing that kind of thing on a daily basis is difficult and challenging, I would say, being involved in this work.
So how does this guy and other believers continue to hold onto their faith despite all this persecution and adversity?
Yeah, it's not easy. And I think it's important to say that, because sometimes we tend to think of persecuted Christians as being these kind of superhero Christians that can kind of cope with anything, but they're just ordinary people like us. And when you go through that kind of thing, it is difficult to cope. And actually, one of the projects that we're involved with in Nigeria is to provide Bible-centred trauma counselling for people who've been through this kind of experience of violence and loss, helping them to process the suffering and to continue to trust in God. So it's definitely hard, but I think, having spoken to a number of church leaders in different areas, I think there's probably three things that they would say in response to that kind of question. They would say, first of all, that they're not surprised by the suffering. So, Jesus made that clear to his disciples: if they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. And the New Testament is just littered with statements like that. 1 Peter 4, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice in so far as you share Christ's sufferings. So there is something that is to be expected about this, and they're very realistic about what it means to follow Jesus. But then, beyond that, they don't choose to endure the suffering because they enjoy it. It's not like a love of pain that they have. They go through it because there is a resurrection at the other side. And I think that's so much a part of what gets them through, that belonging to Jesus might mean suffering in the here and now, but it also carries with it the promise of life and future and glory, and they know that one day they'll be vindicated. So that's a really key way that they endure it as well. And then maybe the third thing to say would be that it's not just a future hope. They're comforted by the fact that even now they are united with Christ and they're filled with his Spirit, and there's so much comfort and reassurance that comes with that. And I think persecuted Christians maybe get to experience an intimacy with God in their suffering that those who don't go through the same level of suffering maybe don't get to experience. Our CEO, Paul Robinson, he always tells this story of an encounter that he had a number of years ago in Pakistan, where he met a lady called Rose, and she had been through the most awful kind of rejection and violence from her own family because of her faith in Christ. And our CEO, Paul, asked her, how did you manage to cope with this? It's so difficult. And she said this to him. She said, it's perfectly reasonable to expect the very best of God in the very worst of circumstances. And I think there is a deep truth in that there is this intimacy and care that comes from our Father in heaven through his Spirit who lives in us when we go through that kind of suffering. So, yeah, that's how they get through it.
Wow. I mean, in your role, how many of these kinds of stories are you hearing in a month, in a year? I mean, are you just continually being fed stories from different countries continually, or are you enjoying them as they come out in the magazines, like I can see when they get delivered to the church? Or how much are you hearing about this happening around the world at a pretty regular interval?
Yeah, daily, I would say. We have ministry partners in about 30 different countries across the world, and I have colleagues who are in contact with them, on a weekly basis, and they'll always have some report of another thing that's happening. And then when we go on the trips, we'll get to meet people face to face who share their stories with us. So, it's a very regular occurrence, and then we kind of collate all of that in the best way to help Christians in the UK hear about it through our magazine and other media outlets.
Yeah. When we started supporting Release and just hearing how the money is being used, in fact, I really do appreciate how much of the money gets to the sources, or gets to the people. But I was kind of surprised at just all the layers of persecution, because a lot of the frontline stories are this pastor and thrown into prison, and yet the ripple effects of that are so huge in a community. When one person is killed, or one person is the families that are affected, and just all of the reach of it. And I feel like I'm just so at a basic level of understanding the ripple effects. Do you have some insight into the massive effect of even just one pastor that's being thrown into prison or killed?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if a pastor is put in prison, it's not just him who suffers; it's his family who suffers, and then beyond that, it's his church who suffers, and then he might lead a network of churches, and then it's the whole network of churches that suffers. And similarly, if a pastor's killed, it's the same kind of ripple effect that goes out. I mean, there's a well-known pastor who's in prison in China just now, Pastor Wang Yi, and I think his church had something like 800 people that were part of it. They ran schools, they ran a Bible college, they obviously had the church. And the Chinese government cracked down on this back in 2018. He was arrested and he's now serving a 9-year prison sentence. And the authorities shut down the church. They surveilled his family and other people in the church. So that's had a huge outward ripple effect.
So how does Release help these people in these situations? What are the kinds of things that they do to help when somebody's thrown into prison or when there's persecution breaking out?
Yeah, you know, we talk about persecution having an impact in sort of 4 main ways. So first of all, you would have prisoners of faith and their families. And that would be in places like China and Eritrea. And so we'll provide material support for the family. You know, if the main breadwinner is taken away, then they just need to survive. So we'll do that. But then also we can sometimes provide legal advice and support to pastors. We're doing that just now in India for pastors who are finding themselves arrested and in prison. But then another area would be Christians who've been forced to flee because of their faith, so uprooted from their homes, sometimes not able to take anything with them. And so again, food and clothing and shelter becomes an important aspect of the way that we can best support them. Then there are Christians who have had loved ones killed, so the families of martyrs. Again, it's a lot of practical support they need, but then trauma counselling as well is an important element of that. And probably the broadest category then is those who face oppression and violence. So in some countries, Christians are allowed to exist, but they are kind of like a second-class citizen. And so there's a lot of marginalisation and discrimination that comes. So again, in those contexts, it'll be material support, but it'll also be things like, you know, we have micro business projects where we invest a little bit and help people to get start a small business so they can provide for themselves and have a platform to lift themselves out of poverty. And then, you know, across all these areas, there's a big element of pastoral care. Sometimes we provide Bibles, sometimes we'll do pastors training courses, sometimes just, you know, pastoral visits and things like that. So there's a whole variety of different support depending on the context.
So how do you think that we in the UK can learn from the faith and the resilience of the persecuted church?
Maybe one of the biggest things we need to learn is that Jesus is sufficient. And if you have everything else stripped away, then he's still enough. We can still depend on him. Because again, as Christians in the West, we are just programmed to put our trust in so many other things, you know, whether that's our salaries or our pensions or our insurance policies or our healthcare or our political freedom. There's so many of these things that are telling us that that's what we need, that's what we can depend on. And those things are good. We're blessed to have them. But I think when we let those things squeeze out our dependence on Jesus, then our faith is impoverished. And our persecuted brothers and sisters teach us that Christ is enough, and when we depend on him, often we grow in a way that we can't if we don't depend on him. And then a whole bunch of other things too, like, you know, think about the forgiveness that believers who have lost loved ones to their enemies have to go through. I think we sometimes hold grudges and find it difficult to forgive people for such minor things. But again, with God's help, some of our brothers and sisters can forgive the most awful things. They can love their enemies. They can pray for those who persecute them. There's a guy called Gideon whose story we covered recently in Nigeria again, and his wife and 5 children were killed when militants attacked his village. He went through a difficult process with that, but just over a year later he's able to go back to the village and he's able to look at the people who were involved in these attacks and say from his heart that he was ready to forgive them and that he could pray for them. So, you know, it's an amazing lesson of discipleship that we can learn from them as well.
Wow, so powerful. Now, I want to ask about misconceptions that we in the West have about persecution. Now, I understand that I probably am exuding them in this interview. Like, man, Brian, you don't even know what questions to ask because of you. You just don't even get it. No, I care, and that's the thing. As I care, and I'm sure that the people listening to this podcast, like, they care about our family, like our family out there that is having a very different experience in their lives because of where they live and what's going on with their faith. But so, I mean, I understand, and feel free to blast me to oblivion on this one, James. But what misconceptions do we in the West have about persecution?
Yeah, there's probably quite a few, and I'm guilty of it as well because, we're all creatures of the culture that we live in, aren't we? And
Yeah.
so I instinctively think a lot of these things and have to self-correct a lot of the time as well. I think people tend to think that stopping persecution should be our number one goal. But again, I've already mentioned this, if the New Testament tells us that opposition is a normal part of what it means to follow Jesus, then how can stopping persecution ever be our number one goal? Because we'd have to stop following Jesus authentically if that was the case, or we just need to withdraw from the world completely. So I think that idea of an expectation of opposition is something that doesn't come naturally to us. Now, that said, we should be praying for justice, and I think we should be doing whatever we can to stop evil in the world and ask God, how long does this have to go on? But ultimately, like, the establishment of freedom of religion in places like North Korea and Iran is not going to be our first priority, because our first priority has to be seeing the kingdom of God grow. And so often that comes through suffering. And it's interesting that the church is growing fastest in some parts of the world where there are the most restrictions, and it's in decline sharpest in some places in the world where there is the most so-called freedom. So that's a misconception I think that we have. And then maybe another thing that you often hear people say is that the persecuted church is kind of like something over there somewhere, and we are the non-persecuted church over here somewhere, almost as if there are two different churches. And that is not the case, because the Church of Christ is only ever one body united together in the one Christ. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, when one part of the body suffers, we all suffer with it. So we shouldn't see ourselves as being fundamentally different from our persecuted brothers and sisters, which is sometimes an instinct that we have. Because if we do that, I think one of the things that it does is it reduces our ability to have an empathy with them, because we see ourselves as being different. But it also makes us say things like, oh, I could never go through that kind of suffering, I could never deal with what they're facing. Quite often people will say that to me, but I think we have to believe that persecuted Christians' faith and resilience comes from God, and that if we were in the similar position that they're in, then God would be enough to give us the same faith and resilience to get through it. So rather than seeing ourselves as different from them, I think we should see ourselves in continuity with them. And we have the same God and the same spiritual resources to draw on for the different trials and difficulties and temptations that we might face in our walk as well.
Wow, that's good. I mean, it's a heavy topic, considering what's genuinely happening around the world with our brothers and sisters, like our family. It hangs on me. It's hung on me for decades. The reality of this. In our context, if somebody's listening today and they're struggling with fear or doubt, what would you say to encourage them?
I think probably, even if it seems like God is far away, He does know what you're going through, and He is in it with you. And He wants you to talk to Him about it. He wants you to be honest with Him. He can handle your questions. He can handle your doubts. There's that well-known passage at the end of Exodus chapter 2, which often resonates with me when I think about the experiences of persecuted Christians. God's people are suffering in slavery in Egypt, and they cry out to Him. And at the end of chapter 2 it says, God heard their groaning. He saw their suffering. He remembered His covenant, and He knew. And I think that is such a profound truth, that God is not absent in our suffering. When we hurt, he hurts. And the cross is, of course, central to the Christian message. And that, if nothing else, is evidence that he is not remote from our suffering. He enters into it with us. And then maybe to come back to what I've already said about just being realistic about the fact that life is going to be hard. And again, we're set up in the West to expect that it's going to be rosy and we'll have a Hollywood ending to all our stories and so on. Life isn't like that. It is hard. But then Jesus says, you will have trouble in the world, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So trouble's to be expected now, but it's not the end of the story. There is that resurrection hope again that all who are in Christ will find. So that's an encouragement.
Oh, wow. That's powerful. So what are the most urgent needs? What are the most urgent needs right now with persecuted Christians?
Yeah, I mentioned before about the different ways that we're helping them. So continuing to be able to provide that help is really important. I think maybe some areas in the world where there are particular crises just now, I mentioned Nigeria, that's been an ongoing crisis for so long, and we are reaching out to support believers there in practical ways and through the spiritual support. We've got several projects in Nigeria. But there are also other areas where problems are growing. India is becoming a much more restricted place for Christians now. We tend to think of India as being, the world's largest democracy, but in actual fact there are many states in India now where they've introduced so-called anti-conversion laws, and that's making it really difficult for Christian pastors to just go about their daily work. And they face a lot of violent opposition now in India. China, an authoritarian system where the house church movement that's been so influential over a number of decades now is really being cracked down on, so much so that our partner for China says it's the worst persecution that Christians there have faced since the Cultural Revolution.
Wow.
So, loads of different places. And if something that always challenges me is when you think about India and China, together they represent about a third of the world's population, and they're two very difficult places to be a Christian right now. So there's a huge scale.
Wow. If somebody wants to make a difference, if somebody's listening and they're like, what's the best way to support Release International's work?
Yeah, first of all, you've got to know about it, don't you?
Yeah.
And I think that that's something we need to be prepared to expose ourselves to. So, get onto our website, follow us on social media, subscribe to our magazine, encourage
ReleaseInternational.org.
Yeah, that's the one, releaseinternational.org.
Yeah.
The magazine is called The Voice magazine. You can read that online as well. So get to know and understand these situations, and that is the thing that's then going to launch you into some kind of proactive response. And then from that, I think people are going to want to pray. And maybe sometimes we think that's like the expected thing that a mission organisation is going to say, we want you to pray. But maybe we don't take that seriously enough. And we do a lot of work to, appeal to politicians and governments and international bodies to do something. But the reality of prayer is that we can enter the throne room of the universe and appeal to the God of the universe to do something about it. So I think that's so important. God has designed it in such a way that our prayers are the mechanism through which he unleashes his compassion on the world. So let's pray. And there's a prayer diary that's part of our magazine that's on our website as well. And then giving is clearly important. I've mentioned a lot of these projects and they depend on the gifts of supporters in the UK. So we're always looking for people to donate generously towards the work and enable us to do more of this stuff.
Yeah. What you said about prayer, like I've got all these biographies on my shelf behind me. Like I try and read a different missionary biography every year, and the power of the inexplicable breakthroughs, the inexplicable shifting of circumstances when Christians from the UK, very often there's stories of Christians in the UK praying and things shifting across the world, and they have no idea the huge impact or the miraculous breakthroughs that are happening or rescues that are happening. I feel so sad about such a general lack of expectancy in our generation, and I just want to keep pushing that. I know that's not with everybody, but just keep pushing that up, because man, when people pray, and when people pray together, when they pray for things that are right on God's heart, like his children who are suffering in different parts of the world, wow, it's really powerful. And yeah, I obviously have been a missionary in the past, and I know just the need and the value for finances. And I don't know if I ever told you this, but like every once in a while, people in our church, they'll be like, "Are the organizations you're supporting being fiscally wise with their stuff?" And I'm like, I trust them. And they're like, "You're so naive." And then they launch like investigations. And several times people have come back and been like, "Wow, actually Release International is really great with their finances." And so, just giving you that feedback, I love hearing the high praise with the financial stewardship over this real sacred mission that you guys have been entrusted with.
Yeah, absolutely. Stewardship's a really important part of it. We want to demonstrate that clearly to everyone, both in the UK and internationally. But by doing that, we also want to encourage other people to think about the stewardship of the resources that God's given them, because it becomes a question that invades every one of our individual lives. How are we stewarding what's God's given us?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how other churches do their budgets or whatever, but our church is always 10%. And I was talking to Pete the other day about this, and maybe it was on the podcast, maybe not, but like how his church is always like 10% giving away. And I just think that supporting the persecuted church is just such should be a real central part of our church's giving blessing strategy. We're thankful for what we receive here, but we also got to get it to those who are needy. But what are simple steps that everyone can do? Church leaders, not church leaders, just everybody could do to take a stand with the persecuted church.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's come back to prayer again. Yeah. So you mentioned about how valuable prayer is, and it's actually one of the first things that persecuted Christians ask us to do for them. They're not asking for us, again, to help them escape the persecution. They're not asking for loads of money for this and that. The first thing they want is our prayers, and I think they've got their priorities right in that way.
It's like, if you know, you know. When you're there, you're like, if you know how significant prayer is, and that it's more significant than anything else, it would make sense that, okay, if nothing else happens, get praying. Yeah, for sure.
Get praying. Yeah. But I think there's an intentionality that needs to be built into that, isn't there? Because we can say, we're going to pray, but if you've not got the information to help you pray, if you've not built it intentionally into the rhythm of your prayer life, then the chances are you're not going to do it. So think about ways that you could do that. We've got a prayer diary which gives just a short prayer point for each day of the month. And just to be able to use that, have it in your Bible or have it on your phone app or whatever it is, and it just pings up. And whether you do it every day or even if it's just once a week that you do it, you've built it into the rhythm of your prayer and you're much more likely to do it then. So I think that is a really important element and the first place where people should start. And then hopefully from that, God grows a desire and an intensity that reaches beyond that then.
Yeah, I'd love to see people even set alarms every day on their phone. Just like the alarm goes off, oh yeah, I want to pray for the persecuted church. Just to keep that, life can get distracting and just pulled in so many different directions, but just that kind of anchoring it back. We just need to be praying for them. I'm
one of the things we were doing this year at our exhibitions that we go to, Christian exhibitions, we are focusing on the theme of supporting the families of Christian martyrs, and we've got big portraits displayed of people who have lost loved ones, and we want that to make a dramatic impact, but we also want to give people something to take away with them. So it's not just an impact in the moment, but it's something they'll remember. So we've got these little wooden crosses. I know you're not able to see it, but we're going to give everyone who visits the stand one of these crosses so they can take it back. It's a tangible thing. It sits on your desk, you pick it up, and that's your incentive to remember to pray for those who've lost loved ones and more broadly for persecuted Christians.
Wow. What gives you the most hope? What gives you the most hope for the future of the persecuted church?
Faithfulness of God.
Okay.
Jesus said that he's going to build his kingdom. The gates of hell are not going to prevail against that. God walks with his suffering people. He preserves their faith. Jesus' resurrection is their ultimate hope and guarantee of future glory. So, And as I already said, the church has grown fastest in some of the places where faith is most restricted. And history shows us that the church has outlasted every empire that's ever existed, even those empires that in the moment seemed unassailable. I'm listening to this Rest is History podcast at the moment about the Roman emperors, and who in the middle of the prime of the Roman world, as they were persecuting the church, whoever thought that could end and that they would no longer exist? But thousands of years later, or 1.5 years later, we're still here. The church is still growing, and the Roman Empire is just a memory of history. And when Release International was first founded through the inspiration of a guy called Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian pastor who spent 14 years in prison in the communist era. Again, at that time there was the Iron Curtain, there was the communist bloc and the rest of the world, and those differences just seemed intractable. But now that's just a memory of history again, and we've had to adapt the way that we serve persecuted Christians because the issues have changed. So we look out in the world today and we've got Islamic militancy in Africa, we've got nationalism in India, we've got authoritarian rule in China. These things seem so difficult, perplexing, but these things come and go, and I think the faithfulness of God and the growth of his kingdom transcends all of that. So that's the biggest hope for the persecuted church.
Wow, love it. Love it. Wow. Maybe last question. If we could see a shift in how the global church responds to persecution, what would you love it to look like?
Yeah, I think I probably already touched on this, but just that taking the fact that we are one body seriously. So supporting persecuted Christians is not just like a kind of niche thing for overzealous people to become involved in. It's actually something that the whole church should be taken seriously all the time. Now, that's not to the detriment of what local churches should be doing in their own patch. So obviously the majority of a local church's focus and resources and energy is going to be implemented, applied locally. But that should never be to the exclusion of the global body. And I think that every time we meet together, every time we share communion together, every time we celebrate Easter together, it's a reminder that we belong to something much bigger than just our own local patch. So if one part of the body suffers, we all suffer with it. Just a recognition of that fact and therefore some kind of a response to it.
I'm just going to pick your brains on some stuff. So I got an email from someone in my church, and we've done better in times past and worse in times past when it comes to having special prayer meetings for missions, for just outside of the UK. I would say that we are on a very low ebb, and so low, and so in need of correction that I get this email this last week saying, Brian, I want to do this. I want to start off a prayer thing. But in your exposure to the church in the UK, and really maybe specifically Scotland, how many churches do you think have regular, even if it's just like once a year or twice a year, times where they sit down and they pray for missionaries, they pray for the persecuted church, where they have a dedicated meeting, not on Sunday, for that purpose? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so you may have heard of something called the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. That happens every November. And that is one of these things, we talked earlier about prayer and building something into the rhythm of your life to make you, or to be intentional about prayer. And the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church is just a marker in the calendar for churches to be drawn towards a focus on that. And I think that's where we see the most fruit in encouraging churches to do that. That if it is going to be a once a year thing, then that's a time to do it. It's a time to bring a focus to it. And whether or not you dedicate part of a church service to it, or you hold a special prayer meeting, or your weekly prayer meeting becomes devoted to praying for persecuted Christians, that tends to be a good inspiration towards it. And quite a lot of churches will become involved in that every year. But I think it's good to be creative about these things. So maybe you do it together with, I think the sort of traditional prayer meeting has become a neglected thing for maybe good reasons and bad reasons. And maybe it's just a format that people aren't as engaged with anymore. But rather than bemoan that fact, I think we need to be creative about how we reinterpret it to get people together to be praying again. And so maybe doing things like, you want to pray for the world, well, have a food night where you have dishes from all over the world, and immerse yourself somehow in the culture of these different places, hear stories on videos from people, or even invite someone who can speak firsthand about these things, and then spend your time praying about it. So be creative, be inventive, but don't just moan about the fact that it's not good. Get there and do it.
Yeah, you preach at a lot of churches. Like, you travel around, right? And you preach in churches, and you share, probably, I'm imagining, at prayer meetings like that when they gather. What tends to be your messaging? Like, let's say somebody invites you to speak on a Sunday. Like, what tends to be these days your messaging for a Sunday gathering?
Well, I try as much as possible to let reflection on a Bible passage lead that. So I said earlier about how the New Testament is just full of stuff. You could say that the New Testament was a book that was written to persecuted Christians, by persecuted Christians, about a persecuted man. So there is lots in the New Testament that resources thinking on this and theology on this. And again, I think that's something we want to be led by. We don't want to be led by what politically correct Western culture thinks about persecution. We want to be led by a biblical theology of persecution. So I would always centre it in a Bible text and then look at what application comes out from that. And it'll be different things. I mean, to be honest, part of our conversation has been led in my thinking by a recent sermon I prepared on 1 Peter 4, which is the three headings in that were don't be surprised about suffering when it comes. Then secondly, rejoice in it because of the hope of the resurrection. And third, Christ is with us in it. And then trust God and do good is what it says at the end of it. So there's a map of how we can respond from one passage, and there's loads of them like them. And then, at the end of those talks, I would always encourage people to respond in the three ways that we've talked about: get to know, pray, and give. So, but there can be other, again, creative and inventive things. I'm always up for doing them. I recently shared in my own home church, and we devoted the whole service to it. So I try to think about what a service might look like in the persecuted church. And one of the things I did at the start was shared the intimations, church notices. Does anybody ever listen to them? I don't know. But what I did was I interspersed the church notices, one from our own church, what was happening that week, and one from what might be a typical notice in a persecuted church. Like, make sure you memorise the passage of scripture this week because we know that people's Bibles are being confiscated. Or please pray for so-and-so because they're in prison and they're not sure when they're going to get out.
Can you even imagine, like, just your normal announcements? Okay, here's the passage. Oh, memorize it this week because you never know. Oh, I love that. It's so great.
So I think it was actually another church that gave me that idea, but
yeah.
There are ways to do that, and you should have seen people sitting up thinking, what's happening?
That's great. Yeah. Oh, I hope every pastor is just you never know, guys. Just getting that Bible memory happen. Oh, that's good, man. That's powerful. Wow. So anyway, so people can go to releaseinternational.org and start that journey. They can probably reach out to you through that website and get the magazine or get the prayer guides or just learn a bit about that and also support through there. That's kind of the main direction, port of call?
Yeah. I'd love it if everyone who listened to this went on www.releaseinternational.org, hit the subscribe button, looked around our website. My contact details, I think, are on there somewhere, jfraser@releaseinternational.org. Get in touch if you'd like me to come and speak at your church or find out anything more. We're really happy to get as many resources into your hands as we can. So yeah, do follow up. Don't just let it be a one-time, there's loads of good points being made there, but I'm just going to let it drift out my memory. Do something about it.
Yeah, so we give them support to Release International, but then the other year, I can't remember exactly when it was, some of my team came to me and said, Brian, Release International sells coffee and really good coffee. What if we did our church coffee from Release International? And my first thought was, oh my goodness, how much is this going to cost? But they were like, it's so part of our DNA and our heart for supporting God's people around the world, and it's great price. But I don't know, And it's great coffee. People come into our church and are like, oh, I love this coffee. I'm like, supporting the persecuted church. But there's just lots of little ways, and love what you guys are doing.
Yeah. Coffee's another way that people can get into it. That's kind of, it was two of our supporters actually that came up with this idea. And what they did was they had a passion for coffee. They loved coffee, but they also wanted to support persecuted Christians. And they looked at the map of coffee producing countries in the world and overlaid that with the map of countries where Christians experience persecution. And it wasn't a complete similarity, but there was a lot of overlap.
Oh, wow.
And that inspired them to think, what could we do? And they thought, if we can share a message, so the coffee's called Hazak coffee, Hazaq, and Hazak is a Hebrew word which means basically stand strong. It's a word that comes up in Joshua chapter 1 all the time, be bold and courageous. And so the message of the coffee is stand strong with persecuted Christians. It's great coffee, but it's also a great cause. And the money that we raise from it goes back into the work of the ministry. And it's again encouraging people, as you drink your coffee in the morning, you take in that taste. Don't just think about fulfilling your own taste buds. Think about those who suffer because of their faith in countries where the coffee's made.
Wow. Love it.
So again, we love you guys for taking that on board. You guys at Rehope like your coffee. You've got a good,
drink
healthy supply. Yeah.
They got to keep awake for me, probably. That's oh, that's great, James. Thank you, everybody. We're not going to do a question today, but you can send in your questions to the Brian and Pete podcast at gmail.com, and we'll be back next week, Pete and I, to answer questions that are coming in. We're getting a lot of great questions, and some of them, honestly, I'm flagging for whole episodes. So I really am appreciating it. I've been getting texts from some of you with suggestions. I've been having conversations with some of you. So keep them coming, and they're having a big impact on shaping where we're going with things. So thank you for your feedback. James, bless you. Bless your work, and thank you for this time.
Thank you so much.
We hope that you enjoyed today's episode of the Brian and Pete podcast. If you found this episode helpful, share with a friend and be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Brian is the pastor of Rehope Church, a multi-site church that started in Glasgow. He is also the founder of Scotland Bible School, a 3-year Bible school where students study every book of the Bible. Pete is the pastor of City on a Hill, a multi-site church across Edinburgh and the Lothians. He also leads Go Global, a family of hundreds of churches spanning 17 countries. If you'd like to submit a question to Brian and Pete, please email brianandpetepodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to having you join us for next week's episode.